Approximately 1/3 of our lives is going to be spent working. The other 2/3 are split between sleep and leisure, and if we're honest, most of us live for those two and we see work as a necessary evil. It's sad to think that many young adults today believe that 40 hours of their week for somewhere between 30 and 40 years of their lives will be spent doing something that they label as evil. But young adults today are exploring new ways to build meaningful and fulfilling careers. The reality is that it takes a lifetime to build a life. With the average tenure of most jobs at 4.5 years, we know that most of us are going to hold a variety of jobs through different seasons of our life. A new concept has emerged in the modern day career landscape, and I've been excited as we've begun navigating it with young adults. The concept is called multi-careering, and it basically says that we'll do more than one job throughout our life, and that it's possible we can do multiple jobs at any one point in our lives. So, if you're not crazy about your 9 to 5, consider putting together 2 part-time jobs. Or if you know that your current job is really a means to a larger end, then do it joyfully, knowing that this is a chapter in the grander narrative of your career story. Today, more than ever, young adults have the opportunity to build a career that says, "This is who I am," not simply, "This is what I do." The beauty in this is greater freedom and higher fulfillment in our jobs. The downside is that life can begin to feel like a game of Tetris and the pieces seem to be coming down at breakneck speeds, and there's a fear that if we don't make the right decision at the perfect time, then we'll never recover. This new freedom can lead to analysis paralysis and the quarter-life crisis that sounds like your mom saying, "Well, Johnny doesn't really know what he wants to do, but it's okay. We enjoy having him in our basement." The older generations know, and they testify to the fact that it takes a lifetime to build a life. Young adults can be somewhat impatient and try to microwave a process that really needs a slow roast. In the next few minutes, I want to look at 2 of the most well-known people in the Bible, and I want to point to some lessons that we can learn from their multi-careering. You might be surprised to find that both Moses and Paul multi-careered. By far, the most prominent person in the Old Testament is Moses. Most of us think of Moses standing in front of Pharaoh, pronouncing the plagues that led to Pharaoh's release of the Israelites from their slavery. And if we know our Bibles, the next pictures that we have of Moses are of him parting the Red Sea and going up to Mount Sinai to receive the law. These are some of the most significant events in salvation history, but their prominence can skew the reality of Moses' career journey. We often overlook the fact that Moses spent the first 40 years of his life living in Pharaoh's household. Exodus 2 tells us that he was taken in by Pharaoh's daughter and raised as a son of Egypt. 40 years is a long time spent developing a career plan and taking the necessary steps to attain that vision. But Exodus 2 also tells us that Moses was wrestling with his place between the Egyptian and Hebrew people. He knew that he was Hebrew, but everything in him had been raised for Egypt. After disputes with both the Egyptian and Hebrew people, he fled to Midian and he became a shepherd for another 40 years. This is in the 2nd season of his life, and that's when he met his wife and began a family. In Exodus chapter 3, he was an established shepherd and father when God appeared to him in the burning bush. Again, we just read through the first 3 chapters of Exodus, not realizing that we're spanning almost 80 years of Moses' life. The parts of his story that come after the burning bush are actually only the final third of his life. So what can we learn from these 3 seasons of life and career in the journey of Moses? The first season of his life, while living in Egypt, Moses had an idea of who he was and what he was supposed to be. The easy thing would have been to ignore his Hebrew heritage and own the opportunities in front of him as an Egyptian. But the easy thing is rarely the right thing. Some of us think that our paths are totally laid out and everything is set in stone. But if we aren't constantly asking God who we really are, or if we deny our true identities, our souls will wither. The second season of Moses' life is really spent in hiding. He was shepherding both his flock and family in the wilderness right up until God caught his attention with the burning bush. In many of our lives, there are these rare experiences where God will call us out of what's comfortable and he'll commission us to do something significant. An experience like this may drastically change your career and family, but not answering the call will cost you far more. The final season of Moses' life was spent delivering and leading the people of God. The majority of Exodus through Deuteronomy focuses on the last 40 years of Moses' career. The Egyptian politician who had become a Midianite shepherd was finally stepping into the role that God had shaped for him among the nation of Israel. But the last 40 years of Moses' career journey are spent in the wilderness, literally in the desert, leading a nation of grumblers and complainers. Which brings me to the last lesson from Moses' life that I want to acknowledge. Often the hardest seasons of our career are the most fruitful. We can't quit something just because it's hard. We can't jump ship just because we're struggling. In the end, those seasons may prove to be the most influential seasons of our lives. So, to wrap up the lessons from Moses before we move to Paul, we need to remember first, the easy thing is rarely the right thing. Second, a burning bush can change our entire life. And third, our toughest seasons are often the most fruitful. Moving over to Paul's story requires us to bounce all over the New Testament, but I want to primarily focus on 3 seasons of Paul's life as well. Much like Moses, Paul began his career in a very different direction. Based on his own testimony in Philippians 3 and Galatians 1, we know that Paul was a zealous Pharisee studying to be an influential player in the temple and synagogues of the first century. From Acts 8, we also know that Paul witnessed and played a role in the stoning of Stephen, while also being a persecutor who struck terror into the hearts of Jesus' early followers. Also, like Moses, Paul had a strong encounter with God recorded in Acts chapter 9, where he is literally knocked to the ground and struck blind. A strong interaction like this may be the necessary gift that God gives us to move us in the direction he wants us to go. If we continue reading Acts, we get the impression that Paul became a major player in the early church movement right after this conversion experience. But closer reading of Acts 9 and Galatians 1 and 2 reveal that Paul spent over a decade doing entry-level ministry outside of the mainstream church. We never think of Paul as entry-level, because the story of Acts picks up and moves so quickly through the first 3 decades of the early church. But again, our fast reading skews our sense of time with these people. For over a decade, Paul was working outside of Judea and under the authority of guys like Barnabas. It really isn't until Acts 15 in the Jerusalem Council that Paul steps into a prominent role in the early church and he becomes the assumed authority on Gentile Christians. What we can learn from the first 15-ish years of Paul's ministry is that being faithful with little things leads to being entrusted with big things. When Peter and the apostles discussed the explosive movement of the gospel among the Gentiles around the world, it was Paul's testimony and experience that propelled him to be the foremost authority. So much so that in 2 Peter 3:15 and 16, we see Peter acknowledging Paul's letters to the churches as equal to Scripture. But those letters that Paul was writing bring up another interesting point for us to consider in our own career journeys. Paul spent his final decade in court disputes and prisons. The letters to Ephesus, Colossae, Philippi, Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, all of them came from the prisons that Paul was in. But we can be encouraged by Paul in this season because his circumstances didn't dictate his impact. So to summarize a few things from the 3 seasons of Paul's life that I think apply to our modern concept of multi-careering, first, getting knocked on your bottom can be a necessary gift. Second, faithfulness in your current season determines influence in the next season. And third, our circumstances should never dictate our impact. So with a flyby look at 2 of the most prominent men in the Bible, we see that the label multi-careering may be new, but the practices have been around for a long time. Both Moses and Paul multi-careered, and looking at their career journeys provides us with insight into how we should build this third of our lives. The 2 things that I really hope young adults develop in our generation are attentiveness and obedience to God with regards to our careers. Attentiveness is constantly asking the question, what is God doing now? while obedience takes it a step further and says, how can I cooperate with that? Both Moses and Paul were attentive to the guidance and direction of God, and both were obedient to their callings. As young adults today, we need to take the long view of our careers and be patient in each season. It takes a lifetime to build a life. The Tetris game that we feel like we're playing is actually moving far slower than we think. The only way to lose this game is to ignore the pieces or choose not to act on the moves you see. Over time, with attentiveness and obedience, some pieces will disintegrate and totally disappear, while others form the foundations for the next season. Multi-careering is a privilege given to our generation, and the opportunity we have to build meaningful and enjoyable careers is not to be taken lightly. Work is a gift, not a burden, and building a career is one of life's greatest joys.